I didn't make the wrong choice. That's what haunts me. I didn't choose badly. I didn't choose recklessly. I didn't choose out of fear. I didn't choose at all. There was a moment, clear, specific, irreversible, when everything depended on my voice. And I stayed silent. Not because I didn't know what to say. Not because I lacked conviction. But because silence felt safer than consequence. At the time, it seemed harmless. Even responsible. I told myself it wasn't the right moment. That speaking up would complicate things. That staying quiet would keep the peace. I believed silence was neutral. I was wrong. I didn't realize that silence is also a choice, one that keeps unfolding long after the moment has passed. Back then, my life felt balanced. I had relationships that worked. A routine that functioned. A place where I understood my role. I valued harmony more than truth. Stability more than expression. I thought that made me mature. When the moment came, it arrived quietly. No warning. No dramatic build-up. Just a pause in conversation. A decision waiting to be voiced. I felt it in my body immediately. That tightening in the chest. That pressure behind the eyes. The signal that said, this matters. I knew what I believed. I knew what I wanted to say. And I didn't. I smiled instead. Nodded. Let the moment pass. Others spoke. Decisions were made. The world moved on. At first, I felt relieved. Crisis avoided. Conflict deferred. Silence had done its job. Or so I thought. In the days that followed, something shifted. Subtly. The situation didn't explode. No one blamed me. Nothing obvious broke. But a quiet distance opened up between me and my own life. I replayed the moment in my head, not obsessively, just occasionally. Each time, it felt heavier. Not because of what happened. Because of what didn't. I had crossed an invisible line. I had learned that when something mattered deeply, I was capable of disappearing. That realization unsettled me. I told myself it was a one-time thing. A situational judgment call. But silence is contagious. Once you choose it once, it becomes easier the next time. I began noticing how often I held back. Not out of fear, out of habit. I edited myself before speaking. I softened opinions. I deferred decisions. I told myself I was being considerate. Inside, something was eroding. I started feeling disconnected from outcomes I was part of. Things happened to me instead of with me. I was present, but not participating. That's the danger of silence. It doesn't scream. It hums quietly in the background, convincing you that nothing is wrong. Until you realize your life is being shaped by moments you didn't enter. Weeks passed. Then months. The consequences of that single moment became clearer. Paths closed. Dynamics shifted. People adjusted. No one noticed my absence. Why would they? I had trained them not to. I felt a strange mix of guilt and shame. Guilt for not speaking. Shame for carrying so much afterward. I told myself to let it go. It's over. It's done. You can't change it now. But silence doesn't stay in the past. It follows you forward. I started to question myself in ways I never had before. If I couldn't speak when it mattered, who was I? I had always believed that my values were internal. That knowing them was enough. But values that aren't expressed don't protect you. They disappear. I realized that my silence hadn't protected harmony. It had protected my image. The image of being easy. Reasonable. Non-confrontational. That image had cost me something real. Something irreversible. I began to sense that this wasn't about that single moment anymore. It was about a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. A pattern of staying quiet when truth felt inconvenient. Of choosing safety over presence. Of letting moments pass instead of stepping into them. The weight of that realization settled slowly. Not as panic. As regret. Not loud regret. Quiet. The kind that sits with you at night and asks one question over and over again: what else have I already lost by staying silent? After that moment, silence didn't stay where it belonged. It followed me. Not loudly. Not accusingly. Quietly, like a shadow that lengthens when the light shifts. I began to notice how often my life moved forward without my input. Decisions were made around me. Plans adjusted themselves. Assumptions settled in place. And I let them. At first, I told myself I was being flexible. That adaptability was a strength. That not every opinion needed to be voiced. But the truth was harder. I wasn't choosing restraint. I was choosing avoidance. The more I avoided speaking, the less natural it felt when I tried. Words that once came easily now required effort. I started rehearsing sentences in my head, and abandoning them before they reached my mouth. Silence had rewired me. I noticed how people stopped checking in. Not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. If you never interrupt the flow doesn't pause for you. I became predictable in the worst way. Always agreeable. Always calm. Always absent from conflict. That predictability cost me something I didn't expect. Influence. I was present, but I wasn't shaping anything. Things happened. I adapted. Life continued. I told myself this was fine. Until it wasn't. There was another moment, smaller than the first, but sharper. A conversation where my input was invited again. A chance to say what I had learned, what I now saw clearly. I felt the opening. And I hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. The silence wasn't situational anymore. It was internalized. I realized then that my earlier silence had taught me a dangerous lesson, that my voice was optional. Once you learn that lesson, it doesn't stay confined to one situation. It spreads. I started noticing how I evaluated myself after interactions. Did I keep things smooth? Did I avoid tension? Did I stay likable? Those became my metrics. Not honesty. Not impact. Not alignment. I began to feel a strange distance from my own values. I still believed in them, abstractly. But belief without expression felt hollow. Values aren't just principles you carry quietly. They're positions you take, sometimes at a cost. I hadn't paid that cost. And now I was paying something else instead. Regret began to change shape. It wasn't about the past moment anymore. It was about the present pattern. I started imagining how my life would look if this continued. Not dramatically. Just incrementally. More moments passed. More chances softened into silence. More decisions happened without me. I saw myself years later, still nodding, still adjusting, still telling myself that speaking up wasn't worth the disturbance. That image scared me. Not because it was tragic. Because it was believable. I began to understand that silence isn't neutral when repeated. It becomes consent. And consent has consequences. I felt anger then, finally. Not at anyone else. At myself. For confusing peace with passivity. For mistaking calm for integrity. For believing that avoiding conflict meant avoiding harm. The harm had just taken a different shape. It had turned inward. I noticed how my body reacted to this realization. Restlessness. A tightness in my chest when I held back. A rush of heat when I imagined speaking and didn't. My body was reacting to years of suppression. I had trained myself to swallow truth so often that my system resisted it. That's when the moral crisis fully surfaced. If I spoke now, I would disrupt established dynamics. I would confuse people who had learned who I was through my silence. I would risk being labeled difficult, inconsistent, changed. If I stayed silent, I would preserve peace, and erase myself further. Both options involved loss. But only one involved honesty. I realized something painful then. The cost of speaking had always been visible. The cost of silence had been hidden. Until now. Silence had cost me momentum. It had cost me trust in myself. It had cost me the sense that my life was shaped by my own participation. I wasn't just quiet. I was absent. That realization brought grief. Not dramatic grief. A slow, heavy mourning for the version of myself that believed silence was safe. I didn't know yet how to reverse it. Speaking up after a long silence feels unnatural. Almost rude. But I knew one thing with clarity that frightened me. If I stayed silent one more time, knowing what I now knew, that silence would no longer be accidental. It would be deliberate. And deliberate silence, chosen in full awareness, is how you give your life away quietly. The question was no longer whether my silence had mattered. It had. The question now was whether I would keep choosing it, or risk everything I had built on quiet by finally opening my mouth. The first time I spoke after all that silence, my voice didn't sound like mine. It was lower. Slower. Uncertain. I noticed it immediately, and almost stopped. Old instincts rose up fast. Don't disrupt. Don't complicate. You've managed fine without this. But something else was stronger. The exhaustion of holding everything in. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't make a declaration. I said one sentence. It wasn't perfectly worded. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't gentle. It was honest. The reaction wasn't dramatic. No one shouted. No one stormed out. There was a pause. That pause felt heavier than any argument could have. Because in it, I understood something irreversible. Once you speak after long silence, you can't go back to being invisible. The room recalibrated. People looked at me differently, not angrily, not warmly. Curiously. As if they were reassessing who I was. That unsettled me. Because silence had made me predictable. Voice made me unknown again. And being unknown is uncomfortable, especially when you've built your life on being easy to understand. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly. Some dynamics shifted. Some expectations dissolved. Some people became cautious around me. Not because I was cruel, but because I was no longer silent. I paid a price. I lost the illusion of control. I lost the comfort of being agreeable. I lost the safety of invisibility. But I gained something else. Weight. My words carried consequence again. My presence altered outcomes. My choices felt real. I realized how numb I had become without noticing. Silence had flattened my emotional range. Speaking reintroduced discomfort, and with it, aliveness. There were moments of regret. Times I wished I had phrased things better. Moments when I wondered if silence would have been easier. It would have been. But easier isn't always safer. I began to notice how my body responded after I spoke. Not relief exactly. Alignment. The tension I had carried for so long began to loosen. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer betraying myself in real time. I learned something essential then. Silence doesn't keep you safe. It keeps you untested. Untested lives don't collapse, they stagnate. I had mistaken comfort for peace. Peace comes from congruence, from living in a way that doesn't require constant suppression. My life didn't become louder. It became sharper. I spoke less, but meant more. I learned to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. To let moments be awkward. To allow friction without retreating. Each time I spoke honestly, the old fear surfaced. And each time, it weakened. Not because fear disappeared, but because it stopped being in charge. If you're listening to this and you're carrying a silence that feels familiar, hear this carefully. You don't owe the world your quiet. You don't preserve harmony by erasing yourself. And you don't lose everything by speaking once. You lose yourself by never speaking at all. I didn't destroy my life by opening my mouth. I changed its direction. Some doors closed. Others never existed in the first place. But one thing became clear. My life was finally responding to me. Silence had taught me how to survive. Voice taught me how to live. Not perfectly. Not safely. But honestly. And honesty, even when it costs you comfort, is the only way to ensure that the life you're living is actually yours. I stayed silent when it mattered most. That's true. But I didn't stay silent forever. And that choice, late, imperfect, irreversible, was the moment my life stopped happening around me and started happening with me. That was the price of truth. And it was worth paying.